and I'm fine with the requisitions.
Me too.
And yes.
And I do have 3 items for consideration not on the consent agenda. The first is a resolution approving an interdepartmental sub-grant agreement between the Warren County Human Services Division and Warren County Children's Services Division to transfer the operation and administration of adult protective services from Warren County Human Services to Children's Services.
What's
So-
going on here?
I don't have a problem with this administratively, like, and I understand the, need to have, you know, you have caseworkers doing children's services work, and there's benefit in having the caseworkers cross-trained and be able to cover and all that stuff. What I'm concerned about, and concern is too strong of a word, but is what I think having our adult protective caseworkers under children's services, and that that division is called Children's Services, I think does a disservice to, it feels like the adults aren't really a priority if we're not even calling that out, that we're responsible for adult protective services. So I understand the rationale for it. I'm not opposed to that, but it feels kind of demeaning to me that it feels like an afterthought when it's not our intention for it to be an afterthought, when it is folded into children's services without recognition that we also are responsible for adult protective services.
Okay, so is the reason for this is for the efficiency and because the adults that are being addressed here, it's all related to their involvement with juveniles, is that right? No?
These are senior citizens that there may be a case where somebody suspects they're being abused.
Outer abuse.
Yeah, it's completely separate from children's services, but the caseworkers who are working on children's services cases, it's similar type of social work, working on adult cases. And, you know, the benefit to it is allowing them to cross-train, allowing them to cover caseloads, and to have a more efficient operation, which all seems prudent. But it's not anything, you know, these are adults that are not in the children's services system.
No, and it has no relationship to children's
Right,
services.
and so all I'm saying is, I feel like, and maybe what this means is, I don't know if there's a timeliness where we have to approve this today, but I sort of would like to have some conversation about how this is, you know, titled, how we're communicating this, because I just feel like elder abuse is something that's serious, it's growing, and we should be reflecting that.
I think that's fair, but my question would relate to, are there still 2 distinctive agencies? There is Adult Protective Services and then Children's Services. So from an operational standpoint, if you're assigned to one of those 2 divisions, that's still your card, it's still your title, there still is an organization called Adult Protective Services, and so from the public perception standpoint, no one knows that they're commingled would be one question, and then the other would be, should we make a macro change and, you know, it's more Warren County Protective Services?
Yeah.
And we drop the name children's or adults from kind of the macro, you know, we still have it on the particular workers who they're assigned to help, but on the big picture, we don't necessarily need the word children's in protective services.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know like all of the implications of that, but that seems like reasonable, but I don't know if there are like legal implications from the court or whatever that's an issue. I just don't know.
So then there's our question of, do we have to do this now, or should we give this a little more thought?
Typically, because adult protective services, the funding comes through human services. So even under human services, it wasn't called adult protective services because it was JFS, because there's the umbrella of JFS.
Right.
So, and other counties do have adult protective services under children's services, so that's not uncommon, or they'll contract it out. And, so it's just like a subset of a department. Our reasoning for doing it here is what we were noticing was we have 2 adult protective service workers who spend a lot of time taking referrals and on the phone and spend very little time with case management being out in the field. So to alleviate some of the phone time and referral time, we put them under children's services for their screeners to take the calls, to get them out, to get these 2 APS workers out in the field with people who are older, because we're seeing a huge increase in referrals, to provide additional services. Obviously, it's a better place because children's services knows how to assess vulnerability and risk much more than human services does, who deals with more with like,
Yeah.
SNAP benefits. But it's not uncommon, even under human services, it wasn't called adult protective, the service itself is adult protective services.
I mean, there are legal issues around the term adult protective services. I mean, that is a legal construct. And all I'm saying is, I totally buy into your rationale. This is an increasing amount of calls around elder abuse. We have a responsibility to investigate these cases, and our caseworkers don't have the capacity to get out in the field. They are getting telephone calls. That is not sufficient. We need a more efficient way to investigate these cases. And this is going to be a growing area. I just don't want them to be placed in children's services for all the very good reasons, as if that's not a priority of this board, because I think it is.
What I could do is, let me call, we can postpone it a week, and I could call a few places that I know have it under their children's services and see how they handle that.
Yeah.
And if they do something with the name of their
Well,
department.
and I'm less concerned about what others do. I'm really concerned about what we are going to do and the message we're gonna be sending to the community about the importance that we place on vulnerable adults in the community. So if it's okay to wait a week, I would just as soon wait a week.
Yeah, there's not, I mean, obviously, we wanted to sit there and make the move, but there's no rush that it has to be today or tomorrow. Nothing to the point that both Commissioner Young and Commissioner Jones have made. I mean, this is actually an effort to actually be much more proactive in this space, but semantically, we need to make sure that it is being demonstrated to the community that we're putting this extra effort into making sure that the adult protective service individuals are out in the field more in the construct that Children's Services brings, and that screening is helpful and allows that to occur. So we can go back and look at those items, make sure we're following all the things relative to law, but also making sure that we're putting it out there to show the importance of what our actions are trying to bring forward.
Well, and the other issue too is that, from the County Commissioners Association standpoint, we always talk about, like, this is an unfunded challenge by the state, and I wanna make sure that we have clear insight as we continue the conversations with the state about their responsibility for adult protective services, so that's clearly delineated, because what we're talking about now is utilizing children's services resources for adult protective services. That has to be properly accounted for, because we want to make sure we have, clean insight into that. So I think the rationale is perfectly prudent. I think it makes a whole lot of sense. But I do want to communicate the right thing to the community, and I also want to be able to clearly understand the budgetary implications over time, as we continue to ask the state to do, to take care of their responsibility here.
So do we solve this problem simply by changing the name of Warren County Human Services Division somehow, from saying it is, instead of just saying that the Children's Services Division, saying it's the Adult and Children's Services Division? Does that solve the problem?
I mean, it could solve the communication problem.
What I'm thinking what you're saying is that it's a matter of perception based upon the rhetorical, the name that we're using to put this in, and what you're doing is, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that administratively and financially, by combining these two functions in one department, we can have oversight over it and frees up the two people that are currently dealing with adult protective services, which is, if I understand what you're saying, is primarily is looking at elder abuse mostly from their children, but it's not really protecting children, it's protecting adults. And all you're doing is you're getting the efficiencies of having them in the same division, is that right?
Yeah, they're talking about using capacity from children's services for adult protective services.
Yeah, but they're talking about it from the standpoint of administration of it. And
Right,
they're-
which means we would have to add administrative support to adult protective services if we don't use children's.
Yeah, but in other words, you're gonna use current administrative services that is more robust in the
Yes.
area of children protective services, and then for adult protective services. And right now, what I think we're being told is that in the adult protective services, they're spending so much time with the administrative tasks that they're not getting out in the field as much as they'd like. And if they're put into the children protective services area, they can use the administration of those services, which is more robust or has more time or more ability, and therefore they would then have the two people that are assigned to adult protective services
In the
would have
field.
more time in the field. And the objection or the concern that is being expressed by Commissioner Jones is that we not look like we're focusing only on children protective services in doing this, and that the problem that I think she's expressing, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is simply because of the labeling of it. Is that right?
Yes, that is my first query, is about how we communicate to the community that we take elder abuse seriously and we're investigating those cases. I also think it's a matter of respect. You know, these are not children, these are actually adults, and, you know, I think there's something about that. So yes, there's something in the naming about it. But there also is something in about how we're getting clear insight into the costs associated with adult protective services, because we're using capacity now for children's services, from children's services, rightfully so, to support our adult protective services work. The state does not fund, and the feds, for that matter, does not fund adult protective services in the way, this is an unfunded mandate that's put on us. And so as we continue those conversations, both with our state and our federal partners about the responsibility and how that cost should flow to the local governments who are actually doing the work of adult protective services, we need to make sure that we are accounting for properly what our true costs are in adult protective services. So that is just, you know, an internal, it's not a reason not to do it at all. It's just, I want to make sure that administratively, we are properly accounting for the cost for adult protective services. And then the second issue is, yes, I think we need to communicate to the community that we take adult abuse, elder abuse, with the same level of importance that we do child abuse and child neglect. And I also think, you know, seniors aren't children, and they're deserving of that respect as well.
So I think that's your task is twofold. Number one, we want to maintain the adult protective services nomenclature, that name and titles, that we want to maintain that. And then I think it's very prudent to track the allocation of time, just to track how much is this actually costing us, just in case the state changes its funding mechanism. And then also coinciding with that, making sure we're not violating some children's services rule. We're using money that's directed for children protective, and now we're clearly using it for adult protective services, or make sure we're not violating something.
We have arranged the funding, the way that we track it is called Random Moments, and anyone that's doing any work on adult protective services will track that through that funding, so we'll know when they're working on children's services or adult protective services.
Fair enough. Thank you. Very good. Okay.
And I do have one other item. we have a resolution authorizing the president of the board to enter into a settlement agreement with the Division of the State Fire Marshal, Bureau of Underground Storage Tank Regulations, for the removal of a buried diesel tank at the Richard Renneker Water Treatment Plant on behalf of the Water and Sewer Department.
This-
So moved.
oh, sorry.
Second.
Yes.
And that's all I have.
Very good. We have a public hearing to discuss a refinancing of hospital facility improvement revenue bond for Colonial Senior Living for a senior living facility in Mason. Good morning.
Back again.
Back again. Good morning, Commissioners, County Administration. I'm going to officially open this public hearing. So this is a public hearing. We were just here not too many months ago.
Your name.
And I'm Josh Grossman with Dinsmore and Scholl. I also have with me Brian Krause. He's the Chief Financial Officer of Community First Solutions, Colonial Senior Services. Those are the borrowers involved here, as well as affiliated entities. So this public hearing is in connection with the possible, and we're asking for the issuance of up to $25 million of refunding bonds to refund those bonds that were just issued last year, as well as to terminate a related interest rate hedge agreement and to pay cost of issuance of this transaction. The original transaction was done as a bank placement, a very short-term bank placement on a variable rate, interest rate setup. This is going to be a capital markets long-term financing, so basically just for the interest rate stability, fixed rate, longer period of times with the market fluctuation to basically negate that risk of movement in the interest rates up and down. If you remember, the deal that we did last time was for the acquisition of the facility located at 5373 Merton Drive in Mason, Ohio. There's no new money with this project. It's just to refinance that existing project. As was the case for the last deal, Community First Solutions and Colonial Senior Services are going to be the borrowers. They're the owners and operators of the facility. This is not the county's debt. It's not a full faith and credit pledge or a general obligation pledge of the county. The repayment source is the revenues from the facility.
Very good. Yeah, and just to reiterate, this is not an obligation of the taxpayer. This is an administrative task of bonds that already exist, and they're just changing their funding mechanism. But this in no way is an obligation of the county. It's just per Ohio law, they have to come before us to basically approve this private financing deal. So with that, entertain a motion to approve this.
Do we need to, is this something we require, any official closing of a public hearing or anything?
Yeah. Yes.
And offer anyone present the opportunity to be heard.
Very good. With that, anyone present like to be heard on this matter? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to close this public hearing.
So moved.
Second.
And yes, and now do we have?
I have a resolution authorizing the issuance and sale of not to exceed $25 million of County of Warren, Ohio Hospital Facilities Refunding Revenue Bonds, Series 2024A, authorizing the execution and delivery of an agreement of lease, a sublease, a bond indenture, an assignment of rights, a bond purchase agreement, a tax exemption agreement, and an official statement in connection with the issuance of such Series 2024A bonds, and authorizing other documents and actions in connection with the issuance of such Series 2024A bonds.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call?
Mr. Young?
Yes.
Mr. Grossman?
Yes.
Ms. Young?
Yes.
Ms. Jones?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Public meeting. Anyone else wish to address the board? Martin, Susan?
I have nothing further.
Very good.
Okay. You need a motion to adjourn?
I will entertain it if that's the board's pleasure.
So moved.
Second.
And yes.